Chapter 19. Too Dutch. Here Mattie was, clickety-clacking on the train again. This time Ellen was with her, heading toward New York State. Ellen had a Mennonite friend, Clara Lance, who had written and told her of a need they had for workers at a children's home. She would meet them at Buffalo and take them to the home. They were elated at the prospect of working with children. When they arrived at the depot, Clara was waiting. After loading their suitcases and bags in her car, she expertly drove through the streets of Buffalo, turning this way and that until they reached the outskirts of the city. There they found the countryside beautiful and serene, with rolling hills and meandering streams, quaint farms and fat cattle. It didn't seem possible that a girl younger than themselves could drive a car so easily. She told of the work they would be doing and about the children there. She was sure they would enjoy it very much. The children's home was in Williamsville. As they drove through the entrance, they saw tall red brick buildings in every direction. "That one over there is the baby fold." Clara pointed toward a building on the left. Then she turned toward another and added, "That one is the children's cottage." It didn't look like a cottage at all because it was 3 stories high. There was another one for the older girls and one for the boys. Then there was a building for the laundry room, dining room, lounge, and office. She parked in front of the office and took Mattie and Ellen inside, where they met Mr. Smith, the administrator. He talked about the work that was expected of them and informed them that they would work in the laundry. They agreed on a wage of $45 a month, which was more than Mattie had ever earned. That evening, they ate in the dining room with the children and became acquainted with a few of them. Some were shy and bashful. Others were talkative. None were boisterous and ill-mannered. Mr. and Mrs. Eve, the house parents in the boys' cottage, welcomed them warmly and told them they would be sleeping in an upstairs apartment in their building. After the meal, they gave the girls a tour of the home and showed them to their room. It was on the 3rd floor at the top of a winding staircase. As they plodded up the stairs, carrying their suitcases and other bags, Mattie absent-mindedly counted the steps. 62, she announced when they reached the top. 62 steps? Ellen asked. Yep, 62 steps. They leaned over the rail and looked down, all the way to the bottom floor. The kitchen was on the 1st floor, and they could see it through the doorway. Their bedroom was light and airy, quite bare, but comfortable nevertheless. The next morning they began their work in the laundry, washing clothes for 30 babies, 30 children aged 2 to 12 years, and 20 girls and 21 boys aged 12 to 16. They scrubbed with scrubbing boards and hung everything outside on long wash lines to dry. Mattie and Ellen soon learned that it rained often in New York, and when it rained, they had to hang the wash indoors. Anything was used for a drying rack if it could hold a diaper, a t-shirt, a slip, or a bed sheet. On Saturday evening, they sprinkled the clothing that needed ironing and rolled it up tight to keep moist. Then on Monday morning, they were ready to iron. On Sunday, everyone dressed in their Sunday best and were taken to church, where the children were quiet and reverent. When they returned to the home, they changed into everyday clothes and played in the yard from dinner until supper time. After the first Sunday, Mr. Smith told Mattie and Ellen they could attend a church of their own faith if they wanted to. Because there were no Amish churches in the area, they decided to attend the Mennonite church. "Why don't we call Clara and ask her to come and pick us up next Sunday so we can go to church with her?" Ellen suggested. "Yes, let's," Mattie agreed. After finishing the day's washing, they walked to the office and asked to use the telephone. "Of course," Mr. Smith said, and motioned to the telephone on the wall. They looked at one another. "Go ahead," Mattie whispered to Ellen. "No, you go ahead." Ellen whispered back. "No, you do." Neither of them had used a telephone before, and they weren't sure how to make a call. "You do. You do. No, you." They were trying not to giggle because Mr. Smith was just across the desk from them. So, just to save face, Mattie bravely picked up the earpiece. It was heavy and awkward. She slowly turned the crank on the side. "You have to turn it real hard," Mr. Smith instructed her. Mattie turned it harder, but still the bell didn't sound. "Harder than that," Mr. Smith said. So Mattie spun the crank with all her might, and Ellen doubled over with laughter. Mattie couldn't help chuckling too, until the operator came on the line asking whom she wanted to call. Mattie quickly sobered and told her she wanted Wayne Lance. While the telephone was ringing in the Lance home, Mattie suddenly turned cowardly. She couldn't talk to someone she couldn't see. Impulsively, she handed the earpiece to Ellen. Ellen tried to give it back, but Mattie pushed it away. She had done the first part. Now Ellen could do the second. "Hello?" Ellen heard a voice greet her and knew that she must answer it. She put her mouth close to the earpiece and said, "Hello?" Then, not knowing what else to say, she asked for Clara. "This is Clara," the voice said. "This is Ellen." Ellen nearly shouted into the mouthpiece. She got right down to business and said, "We'd like to go to your church next Sunday and wondered if you could come and pick us up." "Oh, sure," Clara answered. "I'll be there about 9 o'clock." "Okay, and goodbye." "Goodbye." With a sigh, Ellen replaced the earpiece, thanked Mr. Smith, and the two hurried out of the office. "Whew! Such an ordeal!" Ellen sighed as they stepped out onto the sidewalk. They decided they wouldn't need to use the telephone again while they were there. Tuesday morning, the nurse from the baby fold rushed into the laundry room and asked if either Ellen or Mattie could help her bathe the babies. Her helper had gotten sick during the night. She desperately needed help. Both girls would have enjoyed helping. Since Ellen was elbow deep in sudsy water and Mattie was nearly finished sorting clothes, they decided that Mattie would go. "But next time, it's my turn," Ellen called after them. When they arrived at the baby fold, Mattie thought there must be nearly 100 babies crying at once. "Take anyone you want and give it a bath. There are clean clothes in the bathroom, and make sure you powder them," the nurse said as she hurried to the far end of the nursery. Mattie saw a black baby girl peeking through the bars of her crib. She looked about 9 months old and was as cute as could be, bright-eyed and smiling. Mattie picked her up and took her to the bathroom. There she bathed her and put a soft blue kimono on her. Then she put her back in her crib and unknowingly placed her head at the foot end. Mattie saw a rattle lying on the windowsill, so she picked it up and handed it to the little baby. Then she took a baby boy from the next crib and bathed, powdered, and dressed him. When she returned to the nursery to put him back in his crib, she discovered the black baby girl had turned herself around with her head at the proper end and covered herself with her blanket. She was peeking out from beneath the blanket with eyes shining. Mattie laid the little boy down and went to her. She pulled the blanket down. "You little Betsy," she said, shaking her playfully. The baby giggled and turned over to hide her face. Mattie laughed, covered her up again, and patted her back affectionately before hurrying on to bathe another baby. Hour after hour, she bathed, powdered, and dressed little bodies, putting each one back in their cribs for the day. How they could be so content to lie there, passing the time without entertainment of any kind, was more than Mattie could understand. She would have enjoyed playing with them and letting them sit up and crawl around. When dinner time arrived, Mattie was sorry to leave the nursery and return to the laundry, but Ellen needed her too. On Friday, Mattie received a letter. She looked at it curiously and saw that it was from her sister Sarah. What a nice surprise! She read it immediately. After Sarah's signature, she had added a P.S. "I'm praying for you." "Sarah's praying for me?" thought Mattie. It made her letter sacred. Soon she was receiving letters from Sarah every Friday, and always she ended with, P.S. I'm praying for you. Mattie was deeply touched and hoped Sarah would continue praying for her. Sundays were days Mattie and Ellen anticipated. Clara would pick them up in the morning, and they usually went with the Mennonite youth to someone's house for dinner. Then they played games in the afternoon and went to church again in the evening. One afternoon, Ellen tugged at Mattie's sleeve and whispered that she had a secret to tell her. "Whatever can it be?" Mattie asked. "Lloyd asked me for a date tonight," she answered. "He did? What did you say?" "I said yes, of course." Ellen giggled. "What are you going to do?" "Go to church with him, and then he'll take me home. What else would we do?" Mattie giggled with Ellen. They weren't used to the Mennonite ways, but one thing was sure, they could learn. Ellen and Lloyd began having dates almost every Sunday night. One Monday morning, while Mattie was standing at the dresser combing her hair, Ellen sat on the bed beside her, seemingly troubled. "What's the matter?" Mattie asked. Ellen giggled self-consciously before answering. "Well, last night, just before Lloyd was ready to leave, he asked me the funniest question. He asked if I wanted to go steady." "What did he mean, Mattie?" "Why, Ellen," Mattie turned to her, "he wants you for his girlfriend all the time, you know. He wants to go steady." "Oh, Mattie!" Ellen was horrified. "I'll bet he thinks I don't like him." Mattie laughed. "Well, what did you tell him?" "I just kept saying that I didn't know. Because I really didn't, Mattie. I didn't know if I wanted to go steady or not. I didn't think I was unsteady, so why should he ask me if I wanted to go steady? I just couldn't figure him out," Ellen said. Mattie laughed until her sides ached. "But that's how the Mennonite people do," she explained. "They date for a while, then if they really like each other, they go steady. That means they are serious about each other. And he was wanting to go steady with you, Ellen." "Oh, no," Ellen wailed, covering her face. "I know he thinks I don't like him." Mattie had fun over Ellen, but she knew that she was not above mistakes either. The Mennonite young people were so different from the Amish that the two girls often felt confused and unsure of themselves. Yet there was something genuine about their commitment to the Lord. They felt drawn to them and enjoyed every minute they spent with them. Boys began asking Mattie for dates too, but somehow she could not bring herself to accept them. She knew she should forget Sam, but it was hard. Finally, she agreed to have a date with Ray. He was a pleasant young man, and Mattie thought she would probably feel comfortable with him. They had eaten dinner at Clara's home that day, and her father had asked Ray to lead in prayer before the meal. Never had Mattie heard anyone pray as he did. He spoke as though God was right in the room with them. Mattie had even opened her eyes to see if he was actually praying. Then, in the afternoon, he had followed her to the kitchen. When they were alone, he asked if she would like to have a date that evening. Mattie said she would enjoy that. As the evening approached, her anticipation heightened. She knew that he was a true Christian and respected him highly. Their supper was light, with only popcorn, egg sandwiches, and apple cider. Ray sat beside Mattie during the meal, and she found herself completely at ease with him. He had a quick sense of humor and made her feel special. After the dishes were washed, she excused herself to go to Clara's bedroom to freshen up. When she returned, he was waiting in the living room for her. "Ready to go?" he asked, rising to his feet. He was tall and slim and neatly dressed. "Yes, I'm ready," she smiled. He held the door for her, and they stepped out into the golden evening sunshine. His car was dark blue with hardly a speck of dust. As they rode through the countryside, he asked about her family and seemed especially interested about their life in New Mexico. Too soon they were parked in the churchyard and needed to part for the service. The women sat on one side of the meeting room, while the men sat on the other. She slid onto the polished bench beside Ellen. "So you finally did it," Ellen whispered. Mattie only smiled. What fun to feel special. That night as they drove the short distance to the children's home, Mattie asked about his family. They were farmers and milked cows. He said he thought farmers were doing what God intended people to do, living close to nature and seeing God in their everyday lives. Mattie had never heard that before, but it made sense to her. When they reached the boys' cottage, she invited Ray inside. They went to the kitchen to get a snack. Then they sat at the table and talked about the home and the work she and Ellen did. When he was ready to leave, he stood and thanked her for the enjoyable evening. "And when can I see you again?" he asked. What? When can I see you again?" That's what Mattie thought he had said. "Well, I don't know," she answered. She didn't know when he could see her again. Maybe he'd drive past tomorrow and see her. Or maybe he wouldn't see her again until in church the next Sunday. How did she know when he'd see her again? Ray looked away. "Well, that's all right," he said quietly. Suddenly, Mattie grew nervous and her cheeks burned. What should she have said? She couldn't bring herself to look at him and rubbed her hand across the worn tablecloth. He turned toward the door, and she stood to follow him. Then he smiled and thanked her for the wonderful evening. Her confidence returned, and she thanked him for bringing her home. She told him she had enjoyed it very much. He nodded and smiled, and after bidding her good night, he disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, she asked Ellen what a boy means when he asks when he can see a girl again. "That means he wants to have another date," Ellen said. "What?" Mattie exclaimed. "Did Ray ask to see you again?" "Yes." And I thought, well, Dom, I don't know when he can see me again. Maybe tomorrow, or maybe not until church next Sunday. "Oh!" Ellen screamed and flopped across the bed in a fit of merriment until the tears came. Mattie chuckled, failing to see the humor. Finally, Ellen sat up and explained. "You see, Mattie, he wanted to have another date, and he was asking you when it would suit." "Well, why couldn't he say it in plain words, instead of asking when he can see me again? I didn't know what he meant." "Oh, we're too Dutch for these boys," Ellen groaned. "Now Ray probably thinks you don't like him either, the way Lloyd thinks I don't like him." So the laugh was on Mattie this time. But at least they now knew what a boy meant if he asked to go steady or to see them again. One day, Mattie received a letter from Mother telling her of Mary and Pete's marriage. Mattie was shocked. She didn't know they were engaged. Mother said they had decided it suddenly, and she guessed they thought they might as well go to a justice of the peace and forget about all the work of a wedding. "They think it's a big joke," she wrote, "but I think Mary's too young to know what she actually did. Right now she's on cloud 9, though. Let's hope she stays there." Mattie chuckled. That sounded like Mary. Just go to the justice of the peace and forget about the work of a wedding. At 17, she was too young to know better. One night, Ellen was out late with another boy, and Clara had brought Mattie home to the boys' cottage. Everything was quiet when Mattie entered the front door. She tiptoed to the stairway so she wouldn't waken anyone. Softly she began the 62-step climb to their bedroom. Her shoes were clicking noisily, and she stooped to take them off. She had the first shoe in her hand and was reaching down to take off the other one when she heard what sounded like a gunshot in the kitchen. Badly frightened, she jumped and nearly fell. Not bothering to take off her other shoe, she raced up the stairs as fast as she could, clumping loudly. She reached the second landing, slowed, and was planning to take off her other shoe when there was a second loud bang. Away she went again, clumping all the way to the third floor. There she gathered enough courage to look over the side of the banister, and just as she did so, there was a third bang. Turning, she burst through their bedroom door, dived into bed, pulled the blankets over her head, and hoped whoever was shooting wouldn't find her. For 2 hours, she lay still as death with one shoe on and one shoe off, hoping that Ellen would soon come home and at the same time hoping that she wouldn't. But just a few minutes before midnight, she heard soft footsteps padding up the stairway. Was it Ellen? Or was it a murderer? The bedroom door opened, and Ellen stepped in. Ellen! Mattie sat up in bed. Are you all right? Of course. Are you? Didn't you see anything downstairs? No, was I supposed to? I heard 3 gunshots in the kitchen when I came home. You did? Yes. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure. It was probably something else. I didn't hear or see anything unusual when I came in. But Mattie could not believe that it had not been something out of the ordinary. She knew what she had heard, and she had heard shots in the kitchen. The next morning they asked Mrs. Eve if they had heard anything the night before. It was around 10 o'clock, Mattie told her. That was soon after we went to bed, and we didn't hear a thing. But I'll ask around and see if anyone else heard it, she said. That afternoon, Mrs. Eve stepped into the laundry. Mattie and Ellen were both ironing, which was a warm job in the winter and a hot job in the summer. Sweat was streaming down their faces. I found out who was shooting in the kitchen last night, Mattie. You did? Yes. It was some eggs. What do you mean it was eggs? The cook left 3 eggs on the stove for the night watchman. She thought the coal was nearly burned up and would be just warm enough to cook those eggs slowly. By the time the night watchman was planning to come through and check on things at midnight, they were supposed to be ready. But the stove must have been hotter than she thought because they cooked dry and exploded. They're even splattered on the ceiling. Oh my! That ceiling is high, Mattie exclaimed. It must be at least 12 feet high. Mrs. Eve gave her a motherly smile and told her to wake them up the next time it happened. I couldn't have. I was too scared, Mattie said. But I'm glad to know it was eggs and not somebody out of their mind. As time passed, Mattie was called more and more to help with the children. Mr. and Mrs. Eve went on vacation the middle of October and left Mattie in charge of the boys. Every morning each one hung their pajamas and robe on a hook beside their bed and made their beds neatly. Next, they swept the floors. Not until everything was in place and shining clean did they go outside to play or work in the garden. One morning while she was working in the boys' cottage, Ellen entered the front door. She looked as though she had been crying. I'm ready to go home, Ellen announced woefully. Oh, no, Ellen, I'm having a good time. But I'm tired of this and want to go home, Ellen insisted. What happened? So the sad story spilled out, and many tears with it. The nurses from the baby fold had needed some clothes over the weekend and came into the laundry and messed everything up. Wet clothes were hung over dry ones, and they had taken all the clothes that Mattie and Ellen had sprinkled and folded on Saturday and pulled them apart. Some of them were dry and some were wet. To make matters worse, Mr. Smith had come into the laundry that morning and told Ellen not to put wet clothes on top of dry ones. Ellen had been too upset to tell him the nurses had done it. So now she wanted to go home, and right away. Oh my, I'm not ready to go home yet, Mattie said. Why don't we wait until Mr. and Mrs. Eve come back?" "But will you go then?" Ellen asked. "I guess so, if that's really what you want to do," Mattie said. "It's what I want to do," Ellen answered quietly. "Then we'll go," Mattie agreed. Mattie loved New York and loved the children, but if it was time to go home, then she was ready. It would be nice to be with their families again and to go to their own church. Home was still the best place to be, and maybe it was time they returned. End of chapter 19.